So sometime after Growlanser 1 was released for the PS1, PSX, whatever you want to call it, or just PS, Growlanser 2 was released, and it would also be the very first Growlanser game to be in English. However, though, it wouldn't be until the English version wasn't necessarily released until Growlanser 3 was out in Japan. And while Growlanser 3 is its own game compared to 1 and 2, it kind of does like what the Final Fantasy series does. Like the Growlanser games are numbered numerically, but only some of them have something to do with each other. Like, so for example, I believe Growlanser 1 and 2 have something to do with each other, 3 is its own game, 4 and 5 and I think 6 are like sequels to each other and prequels. Or maybe it's, you know, Growlanser 4 had its own games, but it also had like a PS2 game. It kind of gets a little confusing with 4 because there's 3 versions of it. There's the original PS2 version, which was Japanese only, then there's the PSP remake, which is in English, and then they made a Japanese sequel kind of expanding the story a little bit, but because that came out before the PSP remake, essentially, you know, like all the characters that were in the original PS2 version, there's only some of them that make an appearance, and the rest of them are like somewhere else on the continent, like after. It's kind of like an expanding the story just a tad bit. So, but then 5 and 6, 5 was in English, but 6 was not, and 5 and 6 were actually sequels to each other, and then that was essentially the Growlanser series. The way that Growlanser 2 does work, though, while it is a sequel, it's probably the hardest one to really understand out of all the games and the timeline, because like I said before in the last video, if you watched that, Growlancer 1 had the main character Carmaine like go on his own journey to stop Gavel, and while it is a hard task to complete, because Gavel's not really it's not as easy to defeat as you might think, you know. But I made a mistake in the last video where I talked about how, like, in the second game, there's what is known as it's like Gavious or something like that. Well, come to find out, Gavious was actually a different, it was the king of the same species that Gavel hailed from. So Gavel was powerful in its own way compared to, like, mortals fighting it, but Gavious was the king of all of them, and Gavious created Gavel, and they both suffered the same fate. You know, they were both defeated by the same people that created them, and then their powers were sealed away, but they weren't necessarily defeated yet. They were just sealed away somehow, but they tried to use, like, manipulation of, like, illusions and traveling through time and space to eventually get back to where they originally were, and then they eventually found a way to wage war against, like, the humans. Gavious, rather, was the main focus of the second game, not Gavel. So Gavel was finished by the end of the first game. But what's also really interesting, though, is, I mean, last I checked at least, because, again, Growlancer 1 is never released outside of Japan, and while the game does have an English translation, I'm kind of making my own, because I want to double check to make sure it is right, though, but I'm sure it is. But anyways, so if you never played Growlancer 2, really just like before, the series takes a deep turn. A lot of stuff, like, there's a lot of stuff going on. It's not just one story. Essentially, one idea to look at it is that, you know, in Growlancer 2, it takes place just before, like, just as the events in 1 are going on the other side of the same continent, which is kind of interesting. And then you find out, like, there's, like, a lot of flashbacks. You meet, like, a boy by the name of Wayne Cruz, which is the main character. And he also meets, like, he goes to what is known as a military tactician military school, where in the age of, like, when you're, like, in the Middle Ages, you know, this is really interesting, you know. They talk about politics, they talk about, like, religion and all that, and then, like, you know, like, how everybody just, like, has, like, their own. And what's really interesting is, in Growlancer as a series, I would say what really makes it such a great trilogy is that, you know, there's a lot of things that happen in it, but, like, some of the things that do happen in it, all of it, it's like some of the most important lessons that you can, like, really learn from something. And it really does become, like, this really emotional sort of, like, situation to be. So it's very memorable, like, if you've actually played all of them at least once. And what's really cool about 2 was that in 2 you meet this guy by the name of Maximilian Schneider, and ironically about Maximilian is, you know, he seems like a nice guy just trying to change the world, and, you know, if you actually read the story really carefully, he talks about how, you know, he hates fighting. and he's always talking with Wayne about like how can people be hypocrites essentially? Like how could people like say they don't want to fight but they end up doing it anyways to the point where like everybody just ends up killing themselves, and then in the end it's not even worth it. And it's really interesting because as the game unfolds, when like kind of the prologue of the game rather, or prelude, whatever you want to call it. It's a ring weapon. It's like all the characters essentially find themselves like going their own separate ways. Wayne had his own dream of being like this Imperial Knight. I can't remember exactly what the title of it was called, but he wanted to be like a military officer that served the king. But at the same time, though, Max even asked the question. He was like, asked him, like, what is he in for? Like, what was he essentially trying to achieve out of the goals that he had set for himself? And he also mentioned how there was also this one woman, well, rather a lady he was trying to find. He kind of regretted it because, like, there's a lot of flashbacks to this time when Wayne's like a little boy, and maybe like 7 or 6 years old. And there's like this woman that he meets that like it's kind of like in a field somewhere, and like it was a flower field, I believe. And her name was Arietta, if I remember correctly, and she was supposed to be like this woman that he eventually falls in love with her because eventually she does come back, but she stops aging after a while due to being possessed by Gavious. Now, again, not to spoil the entire game, but to really understand the history of this game, though, what ends up happening is because Growlanser 1 is a sequel. I just found this out recently, but I don't know if it's 100% true. In the remake, mind you, the PS1 version of Growlanser 1 was never released outside of Japan. Then Growlanser 2 on the PS, it's like the PS2 version of Growlanser 2 was on but it still used CD-ROMs though. And then you had the remake of Growlanser 1 that came out in 2009 for the PSP. And Growlanser 1, there was some more characters that were introduced. And what's really interesting, in Growlanser 1, there's a woman that's only in the PSP version by the name of Amelia. And for some strange reason, I don't know if it's supposed to be like Arietta from like another dimension, because like the game kind of gets a little confusing, but like they're supposed to be like, I don't even know if they're really connected rather, but I don't think so, because the way the game states, Arietta is like supposed to be 17 years old, but they never mention like how she goes back in time and kind of like they mention she stops aging when Gavious is possessing her, because you got to understand, Gavel was, unless Gavel and Gavious were in the same game, but anyways, what's really interesting is if you actually fight Gavious, and when you fight Gavious, a long time ago, there was the only way to really, the mortals were only truly able to seal away Gavious. They couldn't just kill it. They had to seal him away, rather. And what was really interesting was they had to take two of the strongest Growlanser, and they had to divide their souls. Arietta's was one of them. And eventually, because Gavious found a way out of this and he still had her soul, he was able to, like, she stopped aging after a while, but her body didn't just deteriorate. He still possessed her, so, like, she was still alive, but, like, again, she wasn't necessarily alive. But it's kind of interesting, though. It's, he's like a god, essentially, so he could essentially use, like, a spirit. Like, he essentially had, like, magic that was, like, really powerful and all. That's essentially how Growlanser goes. But anyways, Wayne, one day Wayne was, fast forward to when Growlanser 2 happens, though, because this was, like, 200 years ago. So Arietta's, like, 17 at this point, but, like, she's been around for, like, a couple centuries, rather. She stopped at the age of 17, and that's when she essentially lost conscious of like who she was and all that. But anyways, Gavious is sealed away in the time and space. He came from another form of like the universe, and he time traveled to the same dimension where Growlanser 2 takes place. So you end up finding out that there was a day where Wayne was like really busy with his father, so like he because this is all in like a flashback at the beginning of the game. They start talking about how he missed that day that he promised to find Arietta, but all he found when he was like 9 7 or 6 or something like that. You know, he was he found from Ocarina. So, you know, he always knew how to play that one song that she liked, or that one song that, you know, she'd play for him. And it's really interesting because sometimes, if you think about it, sometimes, I'm trying to think, the way the game perceives to explain it, it's, you know, Arietta was not always 100% possessed, but because Gavious still had control over her, though, that's why she was technically sort of immortal. So she never aged even when she was herself, but, you know, Gavious, like, did what he had to do, what he did. It's kind of, like, again, you really have to just play the game to really 100% understand, like, what's really going on, but it does explain it very well, though. Probably better than I could, as of right now. But, anyways, what ends up happening is, so that's what happens with Arietta. So, what ends up happening now is, you know, but in the present, though, like, when Wayne is still going through, like, the training, and they're showing you, like, how the game works, you know, eventually Max and, you know, Wayne depart because, like, you know, they graduated from the military. And Max is kind of an interesting person at first. He's very wealthy, doesn't really seem like a bad guy, just really wants people to do the right thing, you know. It's you know, and there's a couple levels where, like, they eventually stumble across something that's actually very interesting. It's called it was like the mask of, like, it possessed people. It was able to, it was powerful enough to make people do the right thing, rather, and or just, you know, whatever the creator of it wanted it to do. So it's kind of like a lot of mind control. That's what these games really focus on, which is actually really interesting. So, you know, they talk about the mask, and so they just kind of leave it there for now, but again, foreshadowing for later. So anyways, you find out that, like, as the game progresses, you know, Wayne eventually becomes, like, you know, he gets to be, like, part of his own, like, military. Like, he gets his own, like, squad and all that, which is actually really cool. He goes on a quest to, like, travel and help people out. Pretty much through the course of the game, you're going to, you know, kind of skipping towards the end now. Like, most of the people that you met in that game are actually going to either be against you or for it. And again, you have to, like, there's a lot of other routes you can take depending on how well you do in the game. And there's even what is known as Wolfgang. You actually eventually go to war with this guy by the name of Wolfgang. Come to find out, you don't learn this on the normal route, but from what I understand, though, because I don't remember if I actually completed that route, Wolfgang is actually Wayne's brother. And Wolfgang's, like, supposed to be, like, a really dangerous mercenary. He's like a badass warrior and all that, who, I guess he just wanted revenge against, you know, politics and government, because they were all, like, a bunch of bureaucrats and all that. So if you know how politics go, you know, yeah, that's essentially the same argument there. But, yeah, that's essentially what, you know, Wolfgang won. And eventually, you know, if you don't side with Wolfgang, eventually you do fight him later on when he, like, fuses himself with a machine. And then he ends up dying because, you know, he's not going to turn himself in so he kills himself, if I remember correctly. But what ends up happening is, like, once you defeat Wolfgang, because they're using, like, these machines as well. Like, it's kind of hard to explain, because Growlanser, again, does things in its own way. But they use, like, these ancient machines where, like, they can seal people's magic inside, and, like, other people get sealed inside of them, and it gives them powers over, like, these really powerful, like, knights and all that. It's really interesting. So, in Growlanser 2, though, what ends up happening is once you essentially stop Wolfgang, essentially, like, it seems like the game's over. You know, there's not really too much to do after. However, though, this is when you start finding out that, you know, this is where you know, you can start finding out, like, who Gavious is and all that. And at this point, you know, you have to go to the space-time. I mean, you'll eventually run into Arietta a few times here and there, but, you know, while she's being possessed, and there's, like, certain things you have. And she's accompanied by, like, what is known as the Ying. I forget. It's either the Yin or the Yang. I forget. I think it's the Ying. And essentially, they're supposed to be, like, the underlings of Gavel and Gavious. It's, like, essentially, like, you know, like, how they breeded and all that. So, like, they have, like, these pure forms rather these pre-forms of like what they'd eventually evolve into. Kind of like, think of it like in Metroid, how like there's like the different like Metroid groups and all that. Like you have like the beta, the alphas, the gammas, and the omegas and all that, and they all look different. It's essentially like kind of like that. You know, they all have like their own tiers and all that. So the Yings and the Yings are still powerful, but they're like when you fight Gavious, like you have to fight like a few of them. But having like overpowered characters is actually a good idea in these games. So, but anyways, when you eventually, you know, depending on if you actually do the side quest, the save area, you get this machine where you have to like eventually save her. And the thing is, it can either go two ways, but it's all determined before you get to this battle though with Gavious. You know, before you fight Gavious, the game will, you know, because again, there's some characters from the very first game that are with you. One of them being, I think his name was Xenos. Xenos was, he was essentially the king of the Colosseum. Like nobody could beat him. Nobody could match his power. And you know, one of the things that he mentioned, because they fought Gaviel, and because Carmine joins the party as well, and he's actually fully voice acted in that game. And what's interesting though is you find out that you know, Xenos mentions that, you know, Gavious isn't necessarily being completely honest. You know, he's probably lying about like what he did with Arietta as well. He talks about, because Gavious actually talks though, and it mentions how like it sealed away, like there's like, it gives like a little history lesson of like what happened, like who it was and where it is before you eventually start fighting it though. And what ends up happening is, before you fight him, you know, they mention how, like, you know, like, he stole Arietta's soul and, like, he wouldn't be able to, like, find her or something like that. But yeah, while he technically does have her body fused away with his, the idea is that if you save her soul, because the idea is that really the only true way that they could defeat Gavious over time was to weaken it. But they had to divide two souls of its weakness. Because again, you know, Gavious kind of suffered the same fate as like Gavel, for example, where like it was created by a bunch of advanced deities, but then it was eventually hijacked, and it was the only way it could really be destroyed was the opposite power. So what they did was they took the magic from, or the Groshu, which is essentially the magic that, you know, the Grolians used, and the Featherins. And what ended up happening was, because again, I forget exactly who did what and what order they did it in, but essentially the idea was that the only way that they could kill Gavious, because so much time passed, it weakened it tremendously. And you also beat it one time, Gavel was like out of the picture. But Gavious was a different story though. Gavious was still sealed away, but its power was also locked away. And the reason why was because it wasn't able to do what it normally was back in the day. Like, so, like, because it was sealed away, because they split the two souls of the two characters, essentially they weakened. Now, I don't know what happened to the other soul, because again, there was two, well, one of them was destroyed, but Arietta still remained. But Gavious is, but the idea is, up until Growlanser 2, Gavious will die, essentially, or at least its soul will die, if Arietta goes along with them. But this isn't entirely true, because there is a way, well, technically there's a way around this. Now, using some of the, I forget his name, but he was like a really nice scientist in the first game. I think his name was, it's like Astral or something like that. You have to, like, he builds this machine that has the ability to, like, teleport, you know, the minds of people. So it's essentially kind of like a mind transferring device. And it sounds cliche, yes. But what ends up happening is, once you complete the side quest, and Wayne has this in his hands, they essentially find a way, because the space-time laboratory, not to get confused with the space-time laboratory from Star Ocean 1, but if you've ever played, you know, Growlanser 2, they have what is known as the, you know, the space-time laboratory as well, like, or whatever it's called. And, you know, what's this tower? you know, it actually gives off a bunch of signals and all that. So what ends up happening with this tower is that as soon as you go to, you know, fight Gavious, the idea is that you can use the tower's signals to reach Arietta's, like, it's like a way, it's an advanced formula, because they know that there's an afterlife in the series, and they have, like, powers that connect to, like, other dimensions and all that. So what ends up happening is, you know, Gavious ends up, like, Gavious cannot be destroyed by normal means, but after they find out that they can technically go into this, all Wayne has to do is take this device and hook it up to, they have to hook it up to Gavious, which then Wayne will have to climb all the way up to the back of the tower, and this still takes some time. Meanwhile, this is why this series is hard, because, like, you got, like, 8 characters, and it's all divided. You have to fight, like, his army, you have to fight Gavious himself, and, you know, meanwhile, Wayne, like, runs up into the back of the tower, and he ends up trying to contact Arietta from, like, the afterlife. And it's really interesting how they do this, because it really shows that he loves her, and again, it's a really great series. You really should check it out. And what's really interesting is eventually, like, she doesn't really kind of believe him at first that, you know, they really can save her, because there's, you know, because Gavious is, like, really strong, and she's been with him for, like, 200-something years. But what ends up happening is they end up finding a way to reverse this. And so, you know, because Gavious was using, like, a mind control force, and he was using, like, some sort of gravitational seal, that's why Arietta couldn't just fly away from him. It was like Gavious kind of had her in his realm, rather. And he only was doing it so he could survive. In some way. It's kind of like, it kind of gets a little confusing, because while his soul was being completely, he knew that he was going to die at some point, because Gavious, like, they had his soul, you know, it was weakening in his power. But at the same time, though, there was a side effect that if he wasn't able to create, like, a clone in enough time, he wouldn't be able to transfer his body and his strength. So Gavious was trying to race against the clock too. You know, he was holding on to Arietta's soul, kind of like a time bomb. But if Arietta was to ever leave him in his current state, he wouldn't be able to transfer his body, therefore he would die himself. So he was trying to find a way to, well, he knew at this rate he had enough time to probably create a body, but because somebody did something about it, especially after they ripped the soul from him, Gavious's body just essentially shut down and deteriorated. Well, it was still there, but there was, like, another character by the name, I think he was like it's like a wolf spirit, rather, by the name of Celrib, or something like Celeb. It was like a three-eye wolf, and essentially the idea was that Celeb was Arietta's guardian, watched over him and all that. And so he decided to, you know, because what's really interesting is he jumps inside Gavel's body and kind of, like, you know, nullifies, like, his powers even further. So, like, you know, he can't do anything about it, but he can still fight you. And so this allows you to, like, go and save Arietta, because he disables, like, the powers that he has, where he's, like, able, but with enough, they were able to pull Arietta's soul out of his control. So it's actually really cool how they were able to save her. Gavel now dies, or Gavious dies, and then you find out that, you know, like, you know, he's not able to do anything, but, you know, but because he dies now, because he took too much damage, he also, you know, it doesn't look like he could come back, but, you know, but that's why Salem stays with him, because it trades. It's either you have Salem or you get Arietta in the games, the way the game works at least. So Salem possesses. Yeah, what does he do? He possesses. What does he do? He possesses. Yeah, he possesses Gavious's dead body, and he stays there just to make sure that if Gavious was working on something else, and somehow, because Gavious could technically reboot itself if given enough time. So it's like, you know, it's weird, because, like, Gavious is kind of think of it like in Resident Evil, where, like, you had, like, the G and T viruses and all that, where, like, yeah, you could kill the host, but it could still come back at some point, through other means. So they were afraid that even though Gavious was dead at this point, but its body still existed. Is it possible that, some unknown force could have came and pushed it even further? You know what I mean? So rather than having that happen again, Sable or Slab decided that it would probably best if somebody stays there and keeps an eye on it. And then once Gavel's body just essentially, once it destroyed itself, it was gone completely, and then Sable would still live. So it was really interesting because then they saved Arietta. Gavious was officially dead because now it couldn't bring itself back to life. And then you had the, but the game wasn't really over yet though. Because after you find out that, you've killed Gavious and it looks like you reverted the threat, you report back to Richard, King Richard of the town, or the king that, you serve under. And what's really interesting is then you find out that that mask at the very beginning is stolen. And this is where the game gets really interesting, because all the people that you met up until this point, well, most of them at least, either side or turn against you. And depending on the route you take, you actually end up ironically fighting Max in the space-time tower once it moves. And what's really interesting is you have to fight him like as he's running into the tower, but at the same time he has all the same Imperial officers that you served under and all that. Most of them you're fighting and you actually have to kill them because they were so loyal to Max's family at the time. Now after you finish doing that, you actually have to go and fight Max one last time. And the thing with Max is you have to kill him really fast because the mask will activate then, and I don't think it's a good thing. Yeah, it's not a good thing. And so there's either three things that can happen. Either you end up joining Max up until a certain point, and Max is, you kind of side with him and everybody, gets possessed by the mask in an attempt to... Because his argument was that, it was really the only way to stop humanity from killing itself, was to possess them, but it was avoiding their free will and all that. That was mainly the major argument with Growlanser 2. But what ended up happening, though, was because there was actually a way around this, they ended up finding out that they could do other things with it as well. So, and then if you defeat Max, he ends up saying that, you see him, bleeding and all that. And he talks about how, he's going to die very shortly. There's no way they can reverse this, and, he kind of starts to realize that, Wayne was right. Maybe this really isn't the best way to do this, but it's, too late to save him. So what ends up happening is he ends up falling off the very tower that you guys fought him on. Falls to his death, rather. Or so you think. Now, I don't know exactly 100% how this ending works, but after you beat the game, you're supposed to go back and report back to the king again. But you can go to a few more places. You can kind of talk around with the people. And one of the children of an orphan, I never really got this ending. I don't really know 100% how this triggered. But there's one way that Max can fall off the tower and survive, and he washes up unconscious next to an orphan house. And he talks about, and Wayne's there with him, kind of like how he was at the beginning of the game, and talks to him about how, he learned a lot from him, rather than him just washing up dead. And I think it's from the same orphan. They do eventually report that, yeah, his body was Maximilian Schneider, that they found his lifeless body floating in the river. After they killed him. But there's different endings you can get, different cutscenes rather. But after that, you essentially report back to, and depending on, I guess there's other endings you can get too, not just the character endings, but other cutscenes you can get. And it's really interesting because depending on who you get, you also can see the different character endings based on who's who and all that. But it really depends though, because you got to meet certain requirements as well, and I mean it's just true, it's just how it works rather. Some of the characters fall in love, some of the I think you had to get all the female endings first before you get all the male endings, if I remember that correctly. I think with the exception of Haynes though, I think Haynes is is one ending you can actually get though, regardless. But anyways, if you never played Growlanser 2 though, essentially the way it ends is, Wayne eventually, you know, keep serving as the same Imperial officer as that, you know, he dreamed of, and eventually it goes off to inspire other people, and depending on what character ending he gets, he either, like, I would want to say he does eventually become a father, but, like, it's not really 100% stated, like, you know, who the wife was, who the kids were, but, you know, it's probably obvious, though, that, you know, because depending on, like, some of the endings he gets, like, you know, him and Arietta's ending, for example, not really sure if you want to say it's 100% canon, because, again, it's still open for interpretation. You know, you can obviously tell they were in love, and that's what ended up happening, because, like, once you saved Arietta, you know, she was still 17 years old, and that's right around the time when Wayne was still the same age, so, again, you can kind of see how this works. Then their time resumes together, and so Arietta can continue aging, because before she wasn't. But it was interesting, though. You know, how, you know, Wayne first met her, and it was like they were this, you know, they were just friends at first. You know, she was still 17, but she kind of seemed on the strange side, though. And then over time, though, she eventually just became possessed. You know, well, she was always possessed by Gavious, even before Wayne was even born. And then you find out that, you know, after he frees her right around that same time period, you know, they just fall in love, and that goes from there. Soulmates forever, rather. Or rather, maybe just other character endings, too. You know, you never know. It could be interpreted any way you want it to. But as far as I'm aware, Growlanser 3 does not take place after Growlanser 2. It's actually, like, in its own trilogy. Well, I mean, it takes place after, but it's like its own game, rather. So again, that's Growlanser 2. If you never played it, I highly recommend it. It was made by, again, it's really worth noting, though, because when Growlanser 2 came out, you know, it actually really was kind of hugely inspired thanks to Lunar, the Harmony of the Silver Star. If you ever played that game, you can find that game on the PS1 and PSP. What's really interesting about that game, though, is that there's a lot of similarities to that game. As a matter of fact, what really kind of got me was if you actually listen to the way Luna sings from Lunar 1, it's actually really, it's kind of like, you know, the way, it's kind of got like the same rhythm, sort of how Wayne Cruz plays, like, Arietta's Ocarina, for example. And it's actually very interesting because the game takes place, there's like a lot of similar themes. Like, for example, if you ever played Lunar 1, the story essentially went like, you know, there was Alex, there was Luna, and there was all these other characters, and they essentially have like these familiars. They go on a quest to like try to make the world a better place, you know, and then you eventually find out like the main villain was also known as Galleon, and, you know, he felt betrayed by his own, you know, by the whole human race because, like, you know, he felt like they couldn't serve without a goddess or a god, so they essentially created one. And so that's what Galvion wanted to do. He wanted to become that leader, help people realize that. And it was kind of like the same thing in Growlanser 2 because, like, you know, Max felt the same way after he found out, like, it's like he wanted to help people out, but it was like the only way to do it was to, like, you know, get people to, you know, not do stupid things, but he felt like, you know, but how do you stop people from being ignorant? You know, that was the problem. And so the idea was that, you know, they use that mask at the beginning of the game to possess people, but they destroy it instead. So it's really interesting because Growlanser 2 and 3 were translated in English by CareerSoft. However, though, was Working Design and CareerSoft, or Game Arts, which is what Game Arts became, was Working Design, if I remember correctly. Is it very possible that they could have been the same company that actually made Growlanser as well, or translated it? Same people that made Lunar. Because again, there's a lot of similarities to it. As a matter of fact, I think that's what even inspired Growlanser 2. I'm still looking into it myself, but it seems like there's a lot of connections to the two, though. And so, again, you know, there's more mysteries that have yet to be unrevealed. Even it's just proof that you can play a game over and over again and still learn new things about it, because it's really interesting. So again, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. Again, look for part 3 of this. You know, again, this is just a series where I talk about video games that you've probably never heard of. Or if you did, you should play. So yeah. Again, comment, rate, subscribe, favorite, share, send me money on Patreon if you want to support this channel. I'll continue to keep making videos every day anyways because this stuff is interesting to me. So, hope you guys enjoyed it. Have a good day, and just see you in the next video.